we have to talk about consciousness. Our life is actually a midpoint between the two deaths. To use the sexual energy in order to achieve enlightenment. The three-dimensional spiral shape encoded in our DNA, in our biology.
Hello everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of the Discomfort-Zone podcast. Now, I apologize if there are any problems. Yes, and thank you for noticing, Rondon. Indeed, I managed this week finally to have a new intro for this series. So I hope you enjoy it. Let me know, what you think. But just managed to finish that up today in time for a new episode. So I'm glad to have that. I haven't yet, as you'll see, those who are watching the video. Oh, hang on. Sorry. Hello. For those who are watching, I forgot to turn on the camera. I haven't yet redid the background image, and I want to do a bit more to the whole setup on OBS. So it's a work in progress. My apologies for the long time that it's taking. But yes, I will be doing that as well in the future. So something else to look forward to. Yeah, no one here yet in chat, but Rondon, thank you as always for being here. Today's Thanksgiving. So for those who are celebrating, hope you enjoy. We don't have much of that today. But that's fine, because I think that we have some listeners who listen offline as well. So we're going to be carrying on as usual, and we'll see if anyone shows up as we go. But for now, Rondon, you're the representative, not just because you have to be here. So if you have any questions about today's episode, then by all means, please share your thoughts and comments. They are often quite insightful. Okay, so, oh my gosh, sorry about that. Enough of this mumbo jumbo. I'll be honest with you, I was just putting my son to sleep a few moments before I was going live here, so I had to set up everything just in time. I hope all the audio levels and everything sounds okay. But for now, we will continue with the show. So I thought it'd be a good idea to do a quick recap of what we've been talking about over the last couple of episodes, because for those who are joining for the first time, we'll just click this episode, and for those of us who might be a little, confused by all of these very slightly lesser known, facts and narratives, then we'll just have a quick recap of what we've gone on so far, and then we'll continue in the story in Druvalow's narrative. So we had this civilization on Lemuria, who were very advanced, and 300 families, 1,000 members became sort of enlightened, and then there was a pole shift, as we've discussed before, and this we're going to come back to again, and at that point the Lemuria sank. And the Lemurians, because they were evolved, they were aware that this was going to happen, and so they managed to both escape and deal with everything in time, and it was a rather smooth transition. And as the Lemuria sank, there was another continent that actually sprung up, which was Atlantis. Oh, Hive Q&A, good to have you here. Oh, and wonderful. Yes, enjoy. We'll be here for the next hour. So, enjoy your meal. So, Atlantis arose, and those 1,000 enlightened individuals, who are called the Nacals, started a new civilization in Atlantis from what they had learnt from Lemuria. And so when they had set up this beginning, they had called to all the Lemurians who had been spread around to come back. And in doing so, they designed these vortices, areas for life to grow. And 8 of those vortices were filled, but 2 were left empty, vacuum. And so 2 alien extraterrestrial races came in to those empty vortices. One of those were the Hebrews, and the other were the Martians from Mars. And as we went over a little bit, the Martians had a very advanced civilization a million years ago on Mars, and it ended in a catastrophe when they decided to experience reality by severing their connection to the source, severing their emotional and intuitive ties, their sort of right hemisphere, as it were, becoming more logical, what we called male thinking or masculine, this masculine side of things. And in doing so, they were advanced technologically and scientifically, but they ended up falling to war and inner fightings, and eventually ended up destroying themselves and their planet. But before the entire species were destroyed, they had constructed a synthetic Merkaba, and they used this to sort of look through space and time and find somewhere that they could escape to, a small group of the Martians before they were destroyed, and found this empty vortex on Atlantis, and so transported themselves to there. And so they joined this Lemurian culture on Atlantis, and were very few in number. And so we spoke a little bit about what they were doing on Mars and their civilization, and I think that's more or less where we left off in terms of the narrative. So we'll continue there, and we mentioned that when the Martians actually came, they were both a minority, a small number of them in comparison to the other Atlanteans, and also they had a very sort of negative perception of that different way of thinking. Unlike the Hebrews who came to Atlantis really to learn about this feminine quality and to be able to advance themselves, the Martians were very much opposed to this way of thinking. But because they were a minority and they had just sort of arrived, they couldn't really do anything about it. They weren't in a position of power. But over time and over thousands of years, the Martians, who were developing new technologies and advancing themselves once again, started to influence the way the Atlanteans viewed the world, to expose them to this alternative way of thinking, the male left hemisphere way of thinking, and in doing so started to change the consciousness of the people, and started to gain more and more power. Although they were still few in numbers, the actual Martians, they began to seize control of the different systems slowly but surely. And so that's more or less at the point where we got to. So we will continue from there to the next major event that really happened, which was this was around 26,000 years ago. There was another pole shift, a slightly minor one as well, not as big as the one that happened when Lemuria sank, but this one was exactly parallel to where we are today. And so in the episode where we spoke about pole shifts in general and what it means, Drunvalo mentions that with these pole shifts, there is always a shift in consciousness that occurs afterwards. Not exactly at the point where the pole shifts. If you remember, we had that diagram with an elliptical that on the two extremes were where the pole shift actually happened, but it was slightly after that point that the shift in consciousness took place. And so where we are today in that elliptical cycle, if we recall a little bit, we have a binary solar system with Sirius, where our sun travels towards and away from the center of the galaxy. And this binary system with Sirius is a sort of marking of where we are in that galactic elliptical in terms of our distance to the center of the galaxy. And as we move closer to it, there is a pole shift where we're starting to move away. And after that is where there is a decrease in consciousness, and vice versa, the other opposite way. If you want to know more and that's the first time you've heard of it, go and check out that episode. It's all there in much more detail. But this polar shift that happened 26,000 years ago was the exact same point that we are here today, meaning right after the pole shift, there is a decrease in consciousness. And so the Martians at this point had obviously started to gain more and more control. And after this pole shift happened, a small piece, well, small in relation, I think it was like half the size of, the size of Rhode Island, a piece of Atlantis actually sank and sort of came off. And when this happened, this triggered a sort of chain of events. And it was rather fresh in the memory of the other Atlanteans from Lemuria, of their beloved continent sinking as well. But unlike then, at this point, most of the Atlanteans aren't as advanced as the Lemurians were there, and so there was a lot of fear surrounding it, fear that Atlantis would sink as well, that they would lose their other second continent, and this became a problem. Now, for a while, they were living in fear and discussing, and this is sort of the beginning seeds of a change in the way they do things. But after about 200 years, according to Drunvalo, they calmed down again, and matters returned to normal, and everything continued as it was. Until around between 13 and 16,000 years ago, again according to Thoth, a comet was approaching Earth. Now, when the comet was discovered by the Atlanteans, it was still in deep space. It was very, very far away. But using the Martians' advanced technologies, they were able to detect the comet. Now, in the narrative, this is a sort of interesting turning point because it's a comparable point in the story to when the Lemurians became first aware that Lemuria was going to sink. And so we see that through different methods, one, the scientific, the masculine, the left hemisphere dominated, the other, the feminine, the intuitive, through these two different ways of thinking and prisms, we can attain the same information. We can reach very advanced capabilities. It's not that one is more capable than the other. But unlike in the case of Lemuria, when the Martians detected the comet in the sky coming towards Earth, they wanted to destroy it because they feared that it was going to, they knew that it was going to come into contact with Earth and cause damage, and their idea to deal with this was to simply blast it out of the sky. The Lemurians, on the other hand, felt that this was an act of the will of the universe, that this was meant to be and predestined, and therefore decided to allow it to happen and not to interfere. Now, this was a crucial decision, but we can see that these very two different ways of thinking led to different conclusions in the end. And although the Martians were opposed, they were still very much a minority. Even though they were in control, they actually couldn't affect the situation to that degree. And so the comet was allowed to hit Earth. And the problem with that was that when the comet hit Earth, it actually hit where the Martians were. And so the Martians were the biggest victims of this decision that the Lemurians took. The Martians suffered heavy casualties and losses, and as can be imagined, this was really a big setback. In the Martians' eyes, and I think we can obviously compare it to a lot of different people's today's, they were struck with both fear and also the sort of disappointment in the trust that they had put in the Lemurians. Although they didn't trust him, then they wanted to do something else, but they were powerless to change it. In so doing, and in allowing the Lemurians to decide their fate, they suffered a great loss. And it was because of this that they came to a conclusion as a society, in Atlantis, to separate themselves from the Lemurians. And the analogy that Drunvalo gives is an interesting one, but I'll repeat it here. He says that it was similar to like a divorce, where the Martians said, we're living here next to you, but we have nothing to do with you anymore. We're not going to have any contact anymore. You do your thing, and we will do ours. And the reason that Drunvalo brings the analogy of the divorce is because he says that in that analogy, we, in today's society, the outcome of that are like the children of the divorce, who were basically the biggest victims of the whole story. And so the repercussions of those events that happened far back in history, according to Drunvalo, are the big cause for what we experience today in our reality. And we mentioned this a little bit in the last episode. I won't go too much into it again. The fact that we have these two opposing worldviews, and we see throughout history that obviously one worldview isn't better than the other. We had a non-scientific view of the world for much of history, which was controlled by religion. which I don't think was any better, and in fact could very well have been much, much worse, empirically speaking, in terms of the amount of suffering, because there was an abuse of power to the same degree. So just one of these modes of thinking isn't necessarily going to sort of guarantee that there is this peace and harmony and unity and cooperation. Each of these methods can lead to cooperation. So it's not that they are sort of, one is the path to destruction and the other is the path to salvation. I want to make that very, very clear, as Drunvalo does. When we think about these different ways of thinking about it, that we can detect comets in deep space using scientific machinery, then we don't necessarily have to follow through with that same mindset in deciding what to do with the problem that we discovered, i.e. whether to blow the comet out of the sky, or in more recent incidents when it was debated whether they should shoot a missile, explode a nuclear missile on the moon. This was a real plan. I think we've actually mentioned it once before, but you can check it out if you want. So we can see these two opposing ways of thinking, and at this point in the narrative, the Martians are basically sort of detaching themselves once again, that same thinking, from the other way of thinking, from the feminine Lemurian way of thinking. It's anyway, it's an interesting story, but we won't get into it now. We've got a lot of very interesting things that we have to get in as well. And indeed, we mentioned, I believe it was 2 episodes, or maybe a few more back, the Martians, when they were living on Mars, created or constructed a synthetic Merkaba. And although we didn't go into too much detail to what that exactly was, it is an important theme that we come to time and time again. Because what happened once the Martians decided what they did was that they sort of went full throttle ahead with their way of thinking and way of doing things. And in so doing, their goal, according to Drunvalo, was to basically seize control of the world, to take over planet Earth, and to control it, quite literally, according to the narrative, using this very advanced technology and this synthetic Merkaba. They would have been able to literally control the people and the creatures who are living on Earth. And to understand a little bit more about that, we're going to talk a little bit about the Merkaba again, the synthetic Merkaba. So what happened was the Martians, remembering that they had done this before. Oh, hi, Crimson Clad. Not too late at all. Wonderful to have you here anyway. Happy Thanksgiving? What do you say? Merry Thanksgiving? Whatever it is, enjoy. I hope you enjoy your evening. We're talking about the Martians on Atlantis and what they were doing there once they decided to separate themselves from the Lemurians, which was to construct the same synthetic Merkaba in order to take over the world, as it were. So the only problem with that was that it had been a very, very long time since the Martians had done this back on Mars. And although on Mars they had managed to successfully construct it, here on Earth they made their best attempt, but they forgot exactly how to do it. Now, we'll talk a little bit about what the Merkaba was. If you remember, I think in one of the first episodes that we started talking about Drunvalo's narrative itself, we mentioned the human Merkaba, the natural Merkaba, and the shape that it was, which were two tetrahedrons, as it were, rotating in opposite directions. So imagine 2 3-dimensional pyramids rotating, one upside down and one straight, and it creates that sort of very famous design of the Star of David, or the star tetrahedron, and that is rotating 3-dimensionally. Now, on top of those 2, we have basically the human body is a living part of that Merkaba, and it's actually what allows it to come into being and allows it to be stable, to function properly. It has a lot of sort of, I don't know what to call them exactly, but fail-safes in the design to make sure that it can only be done properly. And so although we have the potential as human beings to do these things, the power is very much limited and controlled to avoid any disasters. The problem is that with a synthetic Merkaba, you don't have that human body with all of its design mechanisms in order to stabilize it. And so this is a very, very dangerous thing on an interdimensional level. And obviously, when the Martians were doing that, they weren't considering, as we have seen throughout, the ramifications and their place in the universe and in the galaxy. And in doing so, they simply went ahead and did what they did. And when Drunvalo described it, I really felt a deep resonance, a similarity between that way of thinking and a lot of today's scientific research. If we take a very obvious example, though I'm not going to judge it morally, but with the atomic bomb and the splitting of the atom, it's not whether it was, I'm not asking whether it was justified or whatever. I'm simply saying that humanity chewed off more, bit off more than it could chew, took a deep leap into an area that they didn't quite understand yet. And we see this with a few scientific experiments. We see this a lot with the very, very advanced and very young, new scientific areas such as nanotechnology or bioengineering or AI, artificial intelligence. All of these subjects are potentially can have disastrous effects and can be very, very volatile when it comes to cloning, when it comes to artificial intelligence. But humanity has always, seems, the scientific community has always been very gung-ho about moving forward and less about asking questions, and understanding it thoroughly before. Not everyone, obviously, but there have always been cases. So that way of thinking, that way of doing things of, I'm pretty sure I know what I'm doing, and then at times messing up seems to be sort of monumentally occurring here on an interdimensional level. Hi, JBen 1300. Wonderful to have you here through the bridge. I'm not sure where you're watching, probably on Vim, but it's great to have you in chat. Crimson Clad, holidays are always sparse, but it's a good time to talk yourself familiarly and do the show you want to do for yourself. Wonderful. Yes, absolutely. I enjoy being here and talking to anyone as it is. So wonderful to have you here nonetheless. And we'll continue with the narrative. How are we doing for time? Okay, we're doing well. So with this situation, the Martians, as it were, set up what they needed to set up, all of the buildings and constructions. Again, this was sort of on a different dimensional plane from the 3 dimensions that we know. They were working with this synthetic Merkaba. And, on Theta. What's on Theta, Rhonda? And as they were ready to sort of launch their whole project, they flicked the switch and something disastrous happened. And although in Drunvalo's own words, he doesn't even want to describe the horrors because they were so awful. It seems that it was absolutely, a monumental failure, in the sense that as it was spinning out of control, it was sort of in some way ripping the space-time continuum in amongst other things. And so this led to a lot of different problems that are mentioned. But one of the things that I wanted to actually bring here was a quote from the book where he's describing one of the things that happened. And the reason I wanted to bring it is because I thought that it was an important, an interesting fact. So let me just read. This is Drunvalo's description of what happened on Atlantis after the Merkaba was basically turned on and was out of control. And so I'm going to actually post it here on chat as well, so that you have the writing. And for those who are listening, I'm going to read it as well, so not to fear. This out-of-control Merkaba field first of all, released a huge number of lower dimensional spirits into the Earth's higher dimensional planes. So we're going to read through it all so that we get the gist, and then we're going to go through it slowly. These spirits were forced into a world they did not understand or know, and were in total fear. They had no lives. They had to have bodies, so they went right into people, hundreds of them into each person in Atlantis. The Atlanteans couldn't stop them from entering their bodies. Finally, almost every person in the world was totally possessed by these beings from another dimension. Okay, so a few things here. Sorry about that, there was a few gaps that were missing. This is a rather famous notion, an idea, one that we've even experienced in the film industry very vividly, which is when a spirit takes over a body, what we call possession in Christianity. And this idea of possession can stem from a number of different things, obviously, and we have various evidence and sightings that certain possessions were more likely some kind of, medical anomaly, any kind of twitching, any kind of, Tourette's syndrome could be interpreted as a possession. But nevertheless, there are a lot of cultures around the world who deal with this sort of idea, whether it's an agreed possession, meaning with the agreement of the body being possessed, as is the case, for example, with shamans who invite the spirit of the animal to enter them and possess their body, who become one with the animal, who change, as it were. And there's a lot of talk of what they call souls, what we would call spirits, leaving bodies and traveling to other dimensions, and indeed other spirits entering people's bodies, especially in these heightened states. On top of that, obviously, there's the without agreement entering a body and basically taking over by force, normally for people who are slightly out of balance, more susceptible, etc., etc. We can imagine this sort of idea with something like hypnosis, where although we might not imagine it as graphically as a spirit entering in through the nostrils as we see in films and sort of, the person waking up, but the spirit of the hypnotist seems to go in and take over, possess the body of whoever is being hypnotized. And so this idea of spirit, souls, beings taking over human bodies is a very prevalent one. However, with this quote, and the reason that I sort of really wanted to bring it, was because it reminded me very much of another story that you might not be aware of unless you watch South Park quite often. But the story really reminded me of the... what is that? The big religion in America, Scientology. I completely forgot the name for a moment. Really reminded me of the story of Scientology. Now, we're not going to go through all of it, but if you haven't, seen the South Park episode or heard about it, the Scientology sort of deepest secrets of what their hidden mystery religious ideas were leaked by various people and have become now publicly known, much to their dismay, obviously. And it's a very interesting story. Now, obviously, with most people, as they came into contact with it, was just this, crackhead, completely bonkers, made up religion, much like, how people view Mormonism, where Mormons, where it's sort of this alien being and all of these sci-fi descriptions of spaceships, and it all smells very much of a sci-fi novel. And then having the L. Ron Hubbard, the originator of Scientology, yes, exactly, was a science fiction writer. That's exactly what I was going to say. Exactly. So, it comes as no surprise that we view Scientology in that way. And let me be absolutely clear here in saying that I really believe, if you've seen any of the documentaries, I think Scientology is a very dangerous organization, especially for those who speak up against it. Luckily, I don't think I have anything to fear, but it's a scary place from the evidence that I've heard. Hang on. You can read most of it on Yes, if you haven't read the books, maybe you shouldn't pass judgment on the text. I agree. I'm not passing judgment on the text at all. I'm interested because a lot of what they say in the texts is actually very much in correlation to a lot of the different narratives that I've come across. And so, for example, this idea that long ago, a large number of alien beings were sent down to Earth and possessed humans, and it's now sort of part of the work to free ourselves of these humans, these beings who in Scientology are called Thetans, is actually very much similar to this story that we hear from Drunvalo, that these beings from a lower dimension, which is a very different description, but they nevertheless entered the bodies, possessed the humans, and now sort of are inside of them from then on, as it were. Maybe you were answering Crimson Clad. Okay. So, yes, sorry, there's a lot going on in chat. If there's anything, I will, as it goes on, I'll pass in again and again if you have any questions to make sure, and I'll have a look. So, I don't want this to become a story about Scientology specifically, but I do like it, or I think that it's intriguing. I don't really believe in coincidences anymore, and whenever there's a correlation, and very clear correlation and description and narrative between two completely distinct societies, as it were, Drunvalo and Scientology, who were, I think, very much disconnected. It's always intriguing to me to find these correlations because they seem to be a very small percentage, a small chance that this would actually happen just by coincidence. So the story that Drunvalo says is obviously a very long description. This idea of possession was a very one outcome of this tear in the fabric of space-time. And indeed, because this was regarding space-time, and this is what we talked about a bit in a few episodes back, it actually had an effect that rippled throughout time. And so, according to Drunvalo, this synthetic Merkaba that the Martians created on Atlantis was actually tied into the original synthetic Merkaba that the Martians made back on Mars, close to 1 million years before that. And it seems to be, or according to Drunvalo, there is this sort of rippling effect from that original Merkaba experiment that keeps showing up over time. And in that it keeps showing up, there's actually a sort of relationship between when it shows up and what is happening here on Earth and how it affects it. And so I'm going to mention the 4 dates, the 4 years that Drunvalo talks as when these sort of ripples through time happened. And in each of those moments, there was actually the descendants of the Martians on Earth, who are still active today, were responsible to conduct experiments and to basically utilize these ripples of the synthetic Merkabas through time and to advance their agendas in various ways. And just to mention a few of the dates, the first one was in 1913. So again, there was one on Mars. Then there was the synthetic Merkaba that the Martians created on Atlantis, and that ended in a huge catastrophe. And then in 1913, there was this sort of, wave through time ripple that appeared that the Martians' descendants attempted to take advantage of and to utilize. And the following one was in 1943, then in 1983, and then in 1993. And the names of the experiments of those last 3, if you'd like to research this, if you haven't heard of it, were in 1943. It was the Philadelphia experiment. Now, the Philadelphia experiment we actually mentioned, and we spoke a little bit about it. In all of these experiments, by the way, if you go and look on, Wikipedia and everything, obviously all of these are classified as conspiracy theories and debunked and preposterous, etc., etc. But there is a lot of interesting material that I've come across, at least, about these experiments written by people who claim to be whistleblowers, people who claim to have worked from within and have been part of these experiments. And if you're interested in the subject and you'd like to know more specifically about, cases that claim to be documented time travel experiments, then these are the places to look. So the Philadelphia experiment was the first, and that was in 1943. 1983 was called the Montauk experiment. And this was a separate experiment we're not going to get into either, but Drunvalo actually mentions it. We're going to come back to it later, because in that experiment there seems to be a survivor who apparently, or according to him, reappeared many years later, and Drunvalo claims to have met this person in his life, and when he came into contact with him, he had noticed that there was something very wrong with his personal Merkaba field. The one that naturally occurs within us, that we all have, what we call, our aura, etc. This energetic field that's spinning around us, and he found that with this person, it was sort of lacking. He couldn't quite sense it; it wasn't there. And so, according to him, the reason for that was that this working with synthetic Merkabas had obviously affected his own personal, Merkaba to the point where it was actually detrimental to his health. So anyway, if you're interested in any of that, you can go research that. We're not going to get into it too much in this episode, but the idea of time travel and the synthetic Merkabas is one that will play an important role in our narrative further along. And then the last experiment, which was in 1993, occurred around the Bimini Islands, I should say, sorry. Now, the Bimini Islands, for those who don't know, as I indeed didn't know before I heard of them, are situated around the Bahamas, if I'm not very much mistaken. So that sort of area in the southern tip and Central America and southern tip of Northern America. And for those of you who are very good on your oceanic geography, you'll know that there's a very interesting site right near the Bimini Islands, which is the Bermuda Triangle. And this is actually okay, perfect. So this is what we're going to end on for today's episode. And the Bermuda Triangle is an interesting one. It's sort of, I think, to a certain degree, fallen out of favor in terms of conspiracies and the New Age community in general. But it was first reported accordingly in the 1950s, from what I could find, more or less. And then it was a very big deal. You can see it in many sort of television shows and films from that era onwards. And it's become this sort of folklore. And the Bermuda Triangle is basically, for those who haven't heard of it at all, it's this area in the sea that claims that ships and planes that fly through occasionally disappear, or some freaky things happen. The documented evidence and the people who claim is also one that's interesting to investigate if you're into that sort of thing. Obviously the mainstream media and everyone completely denies that there's anything there, and all the proof that's offered is sort of debunked. So I just feel a need to warn, as with all of these things, the same with Sitchin and Drunvalo, etc. Just about everyone I talk about, and most of the things that we talk about here, are going to claim to have been debunked and to be pseudoscience, etc., and that's fine. That's just part of the world that we live in today, fake news, as it were. So I just want to reiterate that if you're interested, you should definitely look for the alternative channels to sort of view this information more generally. Now, that always sounds very shady whenever you say that, because it sounds like there's the reputable sources of information, and then if you don't like what's there, you can go to these, non-peer-reviewed sources of information to get whatever crackpot theory you want. But I don't believe that's exactly the case. I think it could very well be the opposite, where if there is, corruption, if we believe that someone is lying, if the acceptable sources of information aren't telling the truth, then it's very hard to decide what the truth and what the narrative is, because you don't have that signature of approval telling you and guiding you what to listen to and what to not, which is very much where we are today. So that's the reason, as we mentioned before, that correlation and, coincidences, all of these things, if you know anything about sort of solving riddles or, problem solving in general, it's very important to try and notice the small details and try and pick up on things that could be construed as coincidences, because often they can tell us something and have concealed information in those patterns. So that was a little bit of off track, but going back to the Bermuda Triangle, just because the Bermuda Triangle is one of the older stories and it obviously has a lot of traction, so a lot of people who talk about it. But Drunvalo actually offers a solution to what he believes the Bermuda Triangle is. And again, we don't see this very often. It's a triangle, and there aren't many triangles in nature that we are aware of. It's a very precise and therefore uncommon shape. Obviously, there are triangles, especially in terms of the rigidity designs on a microscopic level. But when it comes to huge structures of the size of, areas, the size of the Bermuda Triangle, it's not a very common thing to see, which is what drew me to the attention when Drunvalo first mentioned it, that it's actually the tip of a star tetrahedron. And now that becomes very interesting, because we once again have that same technique that we learned from sacred geometry of seeing a two-dimensional shape, a two-dimensional triangle, and then if you can imagine sort of seeing it from the top looking down, sorry about that, and seeing that it's actually a three-dimensional pyramid. And so that's what he describes, that deep at the bottom of the ocean is this three-dimensional pyramid, tetrahedron, and it's spinning. And for those of you who have been paying attention, you might have guessed already what this means. According to Drunvalo and to his claims, this is actually where the synthetic Merkaba lies today. And it's actually a sort of malfunctioned, unstable synthetic Merkaba that's lying at the bottom of the ocean, and the tip of it is causing all of these, metaphysical disruptions of the ships and airplanes coming through. So it's, according to Drunvalo, it's this warped space-time area with different dimensions being sort of, mixed together when they shouldn't be. In his analogy, he compared it, if we have the human body with organs that are separated by tissue, you obviously don't want these organs coming into contact with each other, because then they don't function properly. That's sort of what these dimensions, what happened to these dimensions. The dimensions are separated by different boundaries that keep them and the contents of each dimension separate. And with the synthetic Merkaba that was out of control and unstable, it basically started ripping apart these boundaries and allowing different dimensions to come together. Now, once again, this idea of sort of different dimensions coming together and crossing over is one that we are familiar with, and this is a big part of a lot of spiritual practices and ceremonies. We see often this talk of sort of a convergence between worlds, dusk being that time in between. But these are all naturally occurring and therefore more controlled, stable states. Although they allow for different things to occur, they always come and go in accordance with time. Not so with the synthetic Merkaba, since it's in a way sort of ripping through uncontrollably. It actually ripples through time because of that, and it still has this cyclical behavior, but it's not a natural part as the others are. So, according to Drunvalo, that is the solution to the mystery of the Bermuda Triangle. But it's an interesting thought to think about, that this idea of the triangle being the tip of a three-dimensional rotating synthetic Merkaba sort of gives a little twist to it. I don't know, in my mind at least. Okay, how are we doing? Excellent. I'm going to just quickly go through chat and see, because there was a lot of talk about Scientology, which is a huge subject. I don't want to get into it because honestly, it's not. I don't talk about many religions specifically. I talk more about spirituality in general because I feel that all religions are attempting to convey spirituality to a certain degree. I mean, whether they do other things as well, but that's really the source for me, the important part of it. I'll time travel. Simon D says, I'll time travel. I would go on a Mars mission experiment too. I'm down for any of that. Wow. I mean, there's now a lot of talk about the Mars experiment indeed going away, so we'll see if that comes up. But I think now, right, they're selling tickets to go up into space, not yet land on a planet, but it seems to be becoming a reality. Okay, so let's see how we are. I think we're going to end it here for now. If you have any questions or anything that I've gone over, please make sure to ask. Soundwave Photon, great to have you here. Sorry, I've forgotten, missed a few people. Ale Indigo, welcome. Yes, that's everyone, I think. And the people who are watching on Vim as well. So, we're going to continue. Actually, I think we can go back a little bit because we have a little bit more time before the end. And we're going to talk about this time travel issue a little bit more because I feel that it's a rather both interesting and sort of confusing one to talk about. We've spoken about it, obviously, that this idea of time travel is actually the same as teleportation. And, the concept is the same concept, moving through space-time in a non-linear fashion. And according to Drunvalo, this is one of the sort of capabilities of the human Merkaba as well. Once it's awakened, it allows you to a certain extent to travel. Now, this obviously might sound very preposterous because we think about it as sort of a spaceship or a vehicle. But if we consider another notion that we've talked about before, the one of out-of-body experiences, we saw that the spirit, the ethereal body, we should call it, has these experiences of leaving the physical body. And once the ethereal body leaves the physical body, those physical laws don't quite apply the same way. Meaning, obviously, you can fly, as is described by most people who have lucid dreams, but beyond just flying, defying gravity, you can travel at unimaginable speeds, or maybe only imaginable speeds, but travel much, much faster than would be linearly possible with a body of mass, as it were, according to the laws that we know of physics. So once you have this separation from the physical body, we can come back to another term that we mentioned. We have this element which we call the speed of thought, the speed not of the, neurons firing electrical charges, but of thought itself occurring, which is not quite the same thing. When we think about that, we can see that a spirit, an ethereal body that is traveling through space, can be traveling almost sort of instantaneously, as it were, what would seem as teleportation to another location, geographic or otherwise. And indeed, I might be mixing up all of these things, but I hope it all comes together. We mentioned the book Anastasia. She talks there about guiding the author, leaving their physical body and traveling with their ethereal body, and they actually visit other planets, and not just the 7 wandering planets that we are aware of in our solar system, but traveling far, far beyond. Because once we imagine that you are traveling with merely or purely the consciousness and not the physical body, then you have none of the physical obstacles that are stopping you, both from traveling at that speed and obviously from being there and, existing outside of our organic, natural environment. So these ideas seem to be sort of, when we talk about time travel in the beginning, it seems like something that's very hard to imagine, because we imagine these huge thrusters on a huge rocket that can push the mass by burning fuel fast enough to reach the speed of light. Where in reality, I think the idea would be much more leaving those physical boundaries and exploring it with our other parts of our being that are more ethereal, that are more capable of these sorts of ideas of traveling through space. As we mentioned, the distances to cover, even to get to Mars, are not possible for humans to survive just in terms of time. So when we think about the Merkaba, the natural Merkaba that we can awaken, as is sort of the core idea of this whole book, it would allow the human body to change dimension, to change from its physical existence in and of itself to being an ethereal plane. And so this is no longer just using the ethereal body by leaving the physical body behind and then ultimately returning to it. And it's not even as was described, if you remember, the Tibetan masters who left their physical body with their ethereal body and then sort of materialized their physical body next to them again. This is now actually, changing dimensions with the physical body through the Merkaba in order to travel as one to somewhere else, and indeed, in doing so, having that sort of protection of the Merkaba as an interdimensional shield in a way. So I hope that was clear enough, but I think that, it's really up to you. I'd love for anyone to let me know in chat how you feel about these things, but I keep coming across a lot of these concepts and ideas, and it's very reassuring, I feel, that we've spoken about most of these things before. So what is a dimension, and how can a body change dimension? What is like the idea of time travel, the idea of teleportation, all of these sort of concepts I feel are grounded in the very, very basic terms that we began with. The things like, the sacred geometry, the rules of the universe, our ability to perceive, etc., etc. Thank you. Thank you so much, Soundwaves Photon. It's wonderful to hear. Okay. So that's enough rambling for now. I hope that was understandable for you. I have to admit that I listened to the last episode to see exactly what we touched on in the narrative, and it was a little difficult to listen with all of the ahs, etc. So I apologize both retroactively and in advance. I've just done it again. Wow. It's so hard, just so you know. If it annoys you, then just try and do it yourself sometime, of like talking consistently without stopping with any of those filler words. But I'm trying to rid myself of it, rid them of the podcast, I should say. So bear with me again. But we said it's a good drinking game if you fancy. I'm not sure if the content should be very applicable for a drinking game. Might make it confusing. But if you ever need another reason to listen to the podcast, then you can always have a shot every time I or ah. Don't do that. That's a bad idea. That's way too many. But I am trying, just so you know. So I hope it's enjoyable for you to listen as well, and I hope that you can hear past all of the filler words and actually gain something of use in your personal lives. I do try to sort of tie it in the end to our experience, but what we're talking about now is it's the narrative. If in Sitchin's book, all we spoke about really was the narrative, and the implications of those narratives to our lives are really sort of up for us to see. With Drunvalo, there's a lot that's going on, and he's talking about a lot of interesting, I think, subjects and concepts. But now we've reached that point in the book, which is really the narrative, and this is actually the core of the backstory, as was with Sitchin, although he didn't continue with it later. He didn't take his narrative to be. I shouldn't say that, because he did actually write a book called The Cosmic Code, which we didn't touch on at all. So he did that as well. But in the podcast, when we finished with Sitchin's narrative, that really was what I wanted to get out of it for this show. With Drunvalo, this narrative that we're going over is going to comprise a part of the book and what we're going to be talking about, which is, again, the idea of the Merkaba meditation and the importance and the capabilities and what the meaning of it actually is. So what I'm trying to say is bear with me for this narrative part. This is sort of the story, and this is why it's not as much fun facts. It really is going through what Thoth says happened, as it were. But once we finish this narrative of what happened in the past and with Atlantis, and then, spoiler alert, Atlantis gets destroyed as well. I hope you knew about that. But consequently, after these things happen, there's a great shift sort of and things that happen on Earth are deeply affected by those events. And that's what we're going to be getting into. And Drunvalo is going to bring us from, if Sitchin was sort of talking about this ancient history up until more or less like the destruction of Sumer in, 2000 BC, more or less, I think. Once Drunvalo finishes with the narrative, we're going to move forward all the way into modern times and really, well, what was for Drunvalo the future when he wrote in 1983. For us, part of it will be in the past already, as was with 2012. But we're going to be talking about more things that are much more modern and relevant to our times. Who can you see? Oh, I'm missing. There's a lot going on in chat, and I couldn't really keep up with all of it. Oh, thank you all for any of your compliments. I really appreciate it because I don't often know, exactly how I'm doing. So I'm glad that you are at least enjoying it and getting something out of it. You can see me. Is that me? No, I don't know. Oh, I see. I thought you were talking about the video. Yes, I would like to just take a moment to apologize to the video viewers as well. I know that the green screen setup today was not the best. I once again had very little time to prepare for this show, as I had some things. I was just putting my son to sleep right before. So I promise I am working to improve. Just a side note for those who want to know, there's so much. I think I mentioned it last week as well, but it's been a very intense time here on the land. A lot of work and a lot of stuff to do. Oh, that's not a problem, Soundwave. We finished. I'm just rambling. Enjoy. Happy Thanksgiving and a Merry Christmas. So there's just been a lot going on outside. I'm glad for those who heard that I managed to get the new intro in, because that was important. I felt that the quotes from the other episodes from Sitchin were really just irrelevant to this series that we're on now. So I'm glad that I got that. And as I mentioned, I will be updating the podcast art as well and get a nice a new backdrop and set up OBS to be a little bit better. I feel there's room for improvement. So I hope that you will stick with me for the journey, that you'll join me along the way as we try and make this podcast the best damn podcast it can be, right? In the world. Why just it can be? Let's not limit ourselves. No, but on a serious note, I really do want to improve on what we're doing here. I have to tell you. Oh, thanks, Rondon. I went back a while ago. I can't remember why. I think when I was, I can't remember, but I went back and listened to the first episode of the podcast. Don't, by the way. No, I'm sorry about it if you want to, but it's just, wow. I think there is an improvement to where I am today. Obviously, there's a lot more to do, but I think it is at least getting better and not worse. So there's that to look forward to as well. But I'm really trying to get that ums and ahs and speak a little bit slowly, and hopefully the experience will be more enjoyable over time. So if you like the podcast, please make sure, those who are listening live, obviously, thank you so much for joining me once again, even on this special day when I'm sure you will have better and bigger things to do. I can't tell you how much it means to me. And for those listening back at home, thank you very, very much for clicking, for joining. If you'd like to comment, like, share, subscribe, invite all your friends, tell everyone you know about it. And I hope you enjoyed it. I've been Olev. This has been the Discomfort Zone. And I hope to see you all next week for another new and fresh episode from the podcast. Until then, have a wonderful evening, and I'll see you all. Bye.